You're listening to Weird and Dead, the paleontology podcast that tells evolution's most embarrassing and bizarre stories. I'm Megan Wetherill.
And I'm Amy Atwater, and we are two living scientists who are weirdly excited about dead things.
On this episode, we talk about sexy diarrhea, eating your own puke, and how dinosaurs got so swole.
Ooh, or really, we talk about how to get big and the things that are holding us back from getting big, evolutionarily, of course. And clearly, given the mention of bodily fluids, you might not want to eat during this episode, so check out the warnings in the description or proceed at your own risk.
For this episode, you should pretend that I, Megan, am weathering out a blizzard in Yellowknife, and not that I just messed up which microphone I was recording on. No, I am at sea, suffering through the Drake's Passage, or something very cool that explains why I sound so very bad. Sorry. Let's talk about hippos, and specifically hippo sex lives, because bizarrely enough, that does play into the conversation today.
Of course.
So hippos are deeply into poop play, which is disgusting, but also kind of a necessity because they have so much poop to give. And that poop is not solid. It's more like a loose butt gravy consistency at best.
Perfect.
To make the best of a very bad butt situation, these male hippos will use their tails like little shit-flinging helicopters to spread all of that, I guess, attractiveness around to females, and somehow that does work because we still have hippos. So if you ever look up a video of hippos shitting, you'll see boop, 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 boop. That's the sound of their helicopter tail. It does say poop, poop, poop.
Duh.
They are nasty. They are super, super nasty. And there is a reason, actually, for that level of diarrhea, which is going to be a big part of today's conversation. Hippos are one of the largest land mammals today. They can be up to 16 feet long, which is approximately 3 megan units. And they are about 1 megan unit in height, pretty much exactly. I guess the maximum height of a hippo is about 5'2", which is what I round up to.
Perfect.
Right?
Aww.
Yeah.
Aww.
Adorable. And they weigh up to about 10,000 pounds. And I'm not going to tell you how many megans that is, but it's a lot of them. So they're huge. They're huge. And they are aquatic, or at least semi-aquatic. They're not trapped like whales. They haven't made that dumb of a decision yet. But even though they are aquatic and they are living in the water, they actually eat grass on the side of their little rivers and lakes, always at night, as if they are embarrassed by it. But there is a strong reason as to why they live in the water, and it is not because they are eating aquatic plants, because they don't do that. They basically have to live in their toilet, because you would also live there if you had to shit 24/7. I want you to imagine having food poisoning all the time. Would you leave your bathroom?
No.
No, you would not. Honestly, they have to have frequent access to water because they have to stop themselves from dying of dysentery.
Yeah, they're like mega dehydrated, I'm sure.
Yeah, they have horrible diarrhea, and so they are constrained to live near water as a result. And this is what is known as a biological constraint. It is the topic of today's episode.
Go home, evolution, you're drunk. I feel like that is like a major theme going on today when we talk about organisms, how big they can get, how small they can get, and why they are constrained to those limitations. Like you said, biological constraints are, frequently like morphological factors or physiological things that limit how an organism can evolve over time, right? Like evolution, again, is not an inventor. If we're talking about how evolution works, evolution has to work with what is already present in the organism. So we like to think of evolution as more of a tinkerer and less of an inventor, because you got to work with what you got. Personally, having just given birth, I'm thinking a lot about biological constraints because of how horrible it was to give birth. So that is a major biological constraint of humans, is our giant heads and our tiny pelvises.
All right, so let's talk about giant land mammals. Now, hippos are quite big. They are very, very far from the biggest land mammals. You'll notice I'm using the word land very carefully. Fuck whales. Mm-hmm. Whales don't count. Whales are fully in the water. Whales eat whatever the fucking krill and bullshit they do. So they don't count. They're a totally different set of biological constraints.
Different podcast episode.
Exactly.
We'll talk about them later.
Yeah, they went back to the ocean and they're not involved in here. But for the biggest land mammal, it kind of depends on who you talk to because, again, estimating the mass of these animals is ridiculous and gives you very wild estimates. So one of the biggest ones, probably, I think the biggest one, just because I want it to be the biggest one, would be indricotheres.
Yes.
So indricotheres were like if you took a giant giraffe and then reskinned it as a rhino, that's an indricothere. The genus is Paraceratherium is the genus name. But yeah, they're just long-ass rhinos, and they got to be huge. The estimates I've read were potentially up to 24 feet tall. I'm not even going to tell you how many megans that is because it's a lot. And up to potentially 40,000 pounds. So, just a little, that's just 4 hippos just stacked on top of one another. Actually, that wouldn't be tall enough. You need another hippo's worth of height. Hippos are chonky.
Wow.
So very, very big animal, and it is related to rhinos and horses. And then the next close contender is an elephant, Paleoloxodon.
Right.
Some people think it might have come in a little heavier at 44,000, but Advait does not, and he's smart. So, yeah.
We listen to him.
Yeah. So I don't think it really was that big. But it was probably pretty big, and it was about 17-ish feet tall. So pretty big. And then there's the biggest artiodactyl. So we've got elephants that are giant. We've got horsey, rhino-y things that are giant. And then we've got the cool ones, which are things that are related to cows and deer and pigs and camels and giraffes. And the biggest one there, as far as weight goes, is hippos. There's an old hippo that's a little bit bigger than a modern hippo. It's like 10%, 20% larger, because that's really the biggest that artiodactyls can be because of this biological constraint. It's not embarrassment out of shitting themselves constantly. It's because shitting yourself constantly has some problems associated with it. But despite that, it's actually kind of a good thing. So this is not like an ad for Activia, but shitting yourself is awesome. Buy my diet tea. When we talk about big herbivorous land mammals, we are usually talking about kind of 2 different styles of digestion. I like to call them the tum-tum crew and the bum-bum crew, because you have ones that have foregut fermentation, so they ferment and do all their weird shit at the start, and you have ones that do hindgut fermentation. They ferment and do all their digestion at the end. Artiodactyls, things like cows and hippos, they have a 4-chambered stomach.
Right.
And that 4-chambered stomach is where they do the vast majority of their digestion. Then they pass everything through their intestines, and the intestines and the colon are what pulls water back out. So that's why they have diarrhea, especially if they get really, really big. They have diarrhea because the pulling out of the water part is at the very end, and usually they don't have a lot of room for it because they have these massive 4-chambered stomachs. Whereas when you're talking about like Paraceratherium, you're talking about rhinos and horses and even elephants, they're part of the bum-bum crew. They have invested more of that nasty ass fermentation shit in their butt region, so in the back half. With cows, as your kind of classic artiodactyl, they do fermentation first. Bizarrely, that is with bacteria, not with yeast. So they're not getting shit-faced drunk all the time. But they do swallow their food very quickly, as it turns out, and they ferment it.
You would know, yes.
And then they frequently puke it back up and then chew it and then swallow it again. So they've got like the fermentation chamber is at the front. And then they have the acid chamber, which is what you and I have. That we don't have that fermentation chamber, despite how gassy we might be. We really only have that hydrochloric acid stomach. Cows have that too. It's just the secondary step. And the reason that is great is because fermentation is done by bacteria. But once the bacteria finish their job, they often get passed back to the stomach of acid. They die and are digested by the cow. So animals that have fermentation that starts first are usually more efficient because they can digest their microbes. Whereas animals like horses They have their stomach first. They have that acid bucket first. And then it goes into a smaller fermentation chamber. Not as complicated as a cow's. I think it's only like 1 or 2 chambers. That's nothing.
Wimps.
And so horses do fermentation second, which means that all of the bacteria that are in that fermentation chamber get passed right out through the butt. No nom-noms. So having that 4-chambered stomach is actually really advantageous for artiodactyls. It means that they can digest really shitty-ass food way more effectively and efficiently. They can live for longer on less food. However, that 4-chambered stomach is huge. So it often does not leave a lot of room for a colon. And the bigger the animal gets, the less room you have, in part because you don't want to have, you have to move your food really, really fast through your stomach, because otherwise you will build up methane and you can, I don't know, explode. I didn't actually look up the consequences of that, but I'm going to go with explode.
Yeah.
You can explode.
Obviously.
Or at least get very, very bad.
Stinky. Super stinky too.
Yeah. So as an artiodactyl gets bigger, they have to process their food a lot faster to avoid, becoming a cow balloon. And so they're passing things through so quickly that the parts of their stomach and their colon, which are already smaller than in a horse, that are designed to take the water out of that food, basically don't have time to do it all the way. So artiodactyls have a size constraint. They cannot get nearly as big as perissodactyls, so horses, or proboscideans, things like elephants, which have a reverse system that focuses more on water. They can take out a lot more water. So horses might need more food than cows do, but they need less water than cows do. But evolutionarily, honestly, I think most modern domesticated horses are just kind of, you look at them funny and they get sick. So if we're talking about like natural wild horses, not the weird ones everybody keeps inbreeding.
Well, do you think that there's any reason behind, we have way more artiodactyls alive today than we do perissodactyls? Like we only have 3 groups of living perissodactyls: horses, rhinos, tapirs, whereas artiodactyls are everything else with a hoof pretty much. Mm-hmm. So do you think that, would you think that gut influences this, that they're being more efficient is an evolutionary advantage too, even though they can't get that big?
I would imagine so. Maybe they can't get that big, but they can sustain themselves on pretty low quality forage, like grass. Grass is gross. Animals have evolved to eat grass, but it's not because they fucking wanted to. It's because that was all there was. Evolution is not a choice. You're forced into it.
Or you die.
We see a rise of artiodactyls and a decline of things like horses and elephants as we see kind of that increase of grasses and grassland expansion. So yeah, horses may have had their toes got smushed together and their teeth got long. Well, artiodactyls still do it pretty good. So what if they shit themselves?
I was also going to ask you which one you'd rather be.
Okay. I mean, I don't like shitting myself. I'm sorry, cows. I know that I feel like I should be with you, but if I had a choice, I'd rather have to drink less water. That's mine. What about you? Do you want to shit yourself or do you want...
We've talked a lot, and I don't know what order we're going to do this in, but we've already established that I have IBS.
Yeah.
So, I'm already fairly used to that. So I'm cool with sticking with what I know and having an efficient system. Stick with what you know.
Yeah. That's fair. Anyways, yeah, so sometimes your stomach can limit how big your body can get. So that's the biological constraint. We really kind of went way around the rosy, way around the bushes in order to get back to that point. But sadly, diarrhea is not the only biological constraint. And in fact, big bodies themselves are not the only ones that have biological constraints. Some small, cute animals also have to pay attention to evolution's rules. Right, Amy?
Oh my goodness. Yes, they do. And this was mostly my excuse to talk about tarsiers, because tarsiers are my favorite animals ever. We're going to talk a bit about primates. Granted, there are really big primates as well. Go ahead and look at gorillas. Those are, yes, also but they have their own interesting constraints too. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So essentially, primates are very interesting and something I studied in school, and I'm fascinated with when we try to reconstruct the size of fossil primates primates, which is what I did a lot with omomyids, which are Eocene primates that lived here in North America and across the world that are closely related, would have been more closely related to tarsiers than any other primates. Tarsiers are the very, very small primates that are found in Southeast Asia that have giant eyeballs, and I always say that they look like they've had way too much coffee or something like that, like really big bug eyes.
They look like they've experienced like a lot of trauma also. Like they don't just look caffeinated, they look shocked.
Maybe that's another reason why I love them so much, especially because graduate school was especially traumatizing for me. Maybe that's why I related to the tarsier so much. That's a really good point. But what's really interesting with primates is it does seem when we try to interpret their size, we can also say a lot about their dietary behavior too, from again their size constraints, and that's an interesting idea. And so it's referred to as Kay's threshold. Richard Kay was the guy who articulated the thoughts first. And so the magic number is 500 grams. What this threshold goes into is that it sometimes makes sense to eat essentially insects versus leaves. So all primates are going to be eating some sort of diet that consists either of an omnivorous diet that is going to be, a lot of vegetation, lots of leaves, fruit, nuts, seeds, roots, tubers, those sorts of things. And also, though, in a lot of primate diets, most of us are omnivorous. Humans are primates as well. Primates as a whole are consisting of lemurs, lorises, tarsiers, monkeys, apes, and humans. And so, we're doing a lot of vegetation. And then also there is a more carnivorous aspect or insectivorous aspect where you might be eating a lot of insects, though some primates are also eating eggs. Some primates are eating lizards, frogs, birds, sometimes even other primates. Chimps are known to literally hunt vervet monkeys as well as bush babies. Like they've been documented using like stabby sticks and like stabbing them into tree wells to try and get at little bush babies and just have like bush baby kebabs.
I feel like that implies more that they know that they're like, it sounds like they're good at it. From the videos I've seen, it's more like they're kind of just poking and hoping to hit something. They're fishing with a stick.
But why would they
It's noodling!
Oh my God. Chimps are just noodling.
Chimps are just noodling for bush babies.
Noodling for bush babies. Heard it here first. Yeah, well, it gets complicated when we try to establish what other species are knowingly doing. However, we do have pretty good evidence that chimps, like male chimps, will get together and go hunt and like murder other male chimps. So they're the only other species besides humans known to do premeditated murder. So, I mean, they are aware on some level. So it does get pretty grim with chimps. Anyway, when we go back to like, why would a primate want to, or why is there this kind of magic number? And when you think about it, it really does make sense. If you are smaller than 500 grams, if you eat a lot of insects are packed with nutrients, tons of protein, tons of calcium, all sorts of important stuff. They're trying to convince me that I should eat grasshoppers. I have a hard time with that. But for small primates, it makes a ton of sense because they're pretty small and they can literally eat them. For bigger primates, after a certain point, it doesn't make as much sense because they're so small and it takes a long time. They're fairly hard to catch as well. So a larger bodied primate literally doesn't have enough waking hours in the day to hunt enough insects to make it worth the time to be a sustainable dietary option. So what they do instead is have more vegetation in their diet, more leaves, more fruit. And this also, when we talk about leaves, like you were just talking about, this is harder to digest. You need a more advanced, I guess, or detailed digestive system to be able to break down this vegetation because of all the cellulose and all these leaves. So you need this more complex digestive process. And small primates are literally not even big enough to maintain a constant throughput of that leafy material. Like they're not even big enough to have the guts that would be necessary to process that kind of vegetation and to really swallow that load. So there seems to be a divide because of their body size.
Swallow that? That's disgusting, Amy. You knew what you were doing.
Okay, but to end this primate segment, if we can include any of it at all, is there's one, I read this research paper from 2020 about one primate, Megan, who is not following these rules. What one primate, Megan, is always doing something different and being fucking weird?
Is it the eye?
Yes. Megan is giving me the eye finger. Yes, because they are fucking weird. They're the weirdest lemurs out there.
The best.
And they are not following this rule because they are just a little bit larger than the 500 gram. And apparently they eat a diet that, as we know from those creepy fingers that they're using to tap into trees and whatnot to find grubs and insects, they're eating about 88% insectivorous diet. So again, eyes, fucking weird, amazing, not appreciated. We love them so much. So thank you, eyes, for again doing weird stuff with bugs. And sometimes, of course, it's not the primates or the organisms eating the bugs. It is the bugs. Hey, you know what's not a dinosaur? Everything on this shirt that Megan made for her clothing store, geopedalfabric.com. You can proudly sport your knowledge wearing the Dinopesaurus shirt and spread the good word. Enter code WEIRDANDDEAD at checkout for 10% off your order.
Like this episode? I hope so, because you have listened to a lot of it. So if so, you should check out more offerings on the Geology Podcasting Network, like Backyard Geology, a podcast all about the amazing things that people have found quite literally in their own backyard. Yeah, bugs. Let's talk about bugs. Let's talk about how sometimes they got really fucking big, like worryingly large. Like today's bugs, there's some pretty big ones and I'm not cool with it. And I'm using bugs in the colloquial sense. I am talking about both insects and arachnids. I know that they're not bugs and technically bugs is a subgroup, but whatever. So today's insects and arachnids and crustaceans and whatever. There's some big ones. I don't know if you knew this, but there's some giant goddamn crabs and lobsters.
Ugh.
American lobsters can almost get to a full Megan.
Ugh.
They're 4 feet long.
Ugh.
Yeah.
No. I mean, yay! Isn't biology fun?
Yay!
I'm going to make a lot of gross noises during this section because me and insects and crustaceans are not always best friends. So we'll see how this goes.
Yeah. Now, of course, lobsters, much like whales, they're in the sea. So they have totally different constraints, but they can get pretty big. Land crustaceans, no, not land crustaceans, land insects and arachnids. I don't want to promise that I looked up crustaceans. I got grossed out enough when I was looking at insects and arthropods. So land arthropods, some of the biggest ones were during the Carboniferous period, which is about like 300 or so million years ago. And they got really big. So Arthropleura is probably one of the more famous ones. It was a big, I think it's a millipede, not a centipede. Well, I'll double check it later. It's one of those two things. Millipedes, they have thousands of legs, but they're herbivores. Centipedes, they have slightly fewer legs. They only have one pair per part, and they are carnivores. So it's one of the ones that has too many legs and is really long. It's like a super leggy plated snake. And these ones got to be more than a single Megan. They got to be pretty much an Amy in length. They got to be about 2 meters long. Yeah, so they were pretty tall and lanky. Well, pretty elongated and lanky. They didn't exactly stand that tall.
Thank God.
They were not going to be America's Next Top Model. They were only horizontal. So we've got Arthropleura. We've got things like Meganeuropsis, which was, they look like dragonflies, but they're not technically dragonflies. They're called griffin flies. And they got to be about the same size as a crow. They had a wingspan of about 28 inches. There was things like Pomona scorpius, which is a scorpion. Weirdly, I think it's from Scotland. And they were about the same size, so crow length, not a crow width.
Thank you for defining that.
Honestly, I don't know if that measurement that I just did makes any sense, let alone when you can't see me doing my own wingspan thing on the video that Amy is watching. Regardless, big fucking arthropods on land. Fortunately, those are no longer around, but part of the reason that they were maybe able to get so big and maybe are no longer able to get so big is a constraint on oxygen. So body size, instead of being controlled by how much diarrhea you have, it's how much you can breathe. Arthropods have slightly different respiratory systems than we do. Insects have a series of tubes, And the way that I saw them described is, you know that like stretchy tube with like ribs that you use on like the laundry machine that like curves real weird, or like on a shop vac.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's roll with this.
Yeah.
Yes.
So imagine that small and snaking all the way through a lot of the body, and that's what you get for the respiratory system. And they don't have lungs. They have a little bit of muscular control, but it's more like if you wanted to take a deep breath, if you had to like do a sit-up. Like they have to use external muscles. There's not like a set of muscles dedicated to trachea. So they have like passive air transport essentially. Spiders and scorpions have some similar stuff. They also have that passive air transport, but they also have like this bigger organ called a book lung that does a little bit more of that. But one big thing that all arthropods have is an open circulatory system. So imagine this doesn't make sense. It's like a polyamorous circulatory system. It goes everywhere. Like it is not constrained by any one vein or artery. It's all over the place. Yeah, insects don't have veins. They don't have arteries. They just smush that blood all around their body and then just hope that it gets to the right spot. So they actually don't do a lot, right? Yeah.
They're like a gusher.
They are. They're just like a gusher. Just like a gusher, 100%.
Delicious.
As a result, they have slightly different limitations on size because it's not the same system. So with us, we have the lungs, and then it goes into the blood, and then it gets sent to all the places that it needs to go. With insects, it goes into the trachea and it diffuses into the blood, but the blood has to get sloshed around inside the bug in order for that oxygen to get to different parts of the animal. So what this means is that as insects and spiders get bigger, they have to have more and more of these little trachea tubes, and they actually have to have more than you would expect. So we were talking about like isometry and allometry earlier and how scaling is kind of weird sometimes. You can't just take a bug and make it bigger and just make the tubes wider, especially not with passive airflow. You need to have relatively small tubes, and that means that they have to have more contact with the rest of the body. So you have to have more tubes. So as insects get bigger, they have to dedicate more of their body space to tubes, which is part of why today we don't have bugs that are just like walking around full of air tubes because it's just too difficult. They'd be like 90% air tubes if they were super big. You're making a face. This is natural.
Oh, well, just imagining bugs still this big, I don't.
Yeah.
And I think you're getting there about how and why things were different in the Carboniferous that allowed for them to actually, right? Like, I'm glad that the things are not the same as the Carboniferous right now for a lot of reasons.
Yes. One big difference in the Carboniferous is that the oxygen levels were different because at that point, bacteria were actually not very good at breaking down wood. So a lot of carbon dioxide was being pulled out, and there was less when you're like decomposing something, not you personally, but like when bacteria do it, they also they bring in a lot of oxygen, and because they weren't very good at decomposing things, they were not burning as much oxygen as they used to, and there was a lot of plant life pumping oxygen into the air. And so moral of the story is today we have about 22 kilopascals of oxygen in our atmosphere. During the Carboniferous, estimates vary, it was somewhere between 30 and 35. So we would have probably all been a little bit stoned and goofy if we lived during the Carboniferous. Well, if we went back to the Carboniferous.
Then now that part of the Carboniferous I can get behind. That part sounds cool.
Right. Okay. You want to be stoned and goofy and then see a 6-foot-long millipede? No, you don't.
It's a bad trip.
That sounds even worse. The worst trip. Yeah, so during the Carboniferous, because they had such high oxygen, they didn't have to have quite as efficient of a trachea system. So really, when we talk about constraints on insect size, a lot of times we talk about it as if it was oxygen that was the constraint. It's not oxygen that's the constraint. It's the fact that they can't be full of tubes. So if you have more oxygen, you avoid that biological constraint. But thankfully today, we don't have that much oxygen, so the insects are just fucked. They can't get that big. Weirdly, One of the other reasons that we may not have big insects today is actually not this biological constraint of trachea size and open circulatory systems. It's birds.
Thank you, birds.
Right? So there's actually lots and lots of very large flying insects that continue after the Carboniferous. So they continue into the Mesozoic with dinosaurs during a time when oxygen levels were much lower than they were in the Carboniferous. So these big griffin flies in particular, crow-sized, wide crow-sized dragonfly things, these griffin flies, went extinct basically at the same time that birds evolved. Either because birds were like, fuck yeah, that looks delicious, or they were looking at the griffin fly's food and saying, fuck yeah, that looks delicious, and they outcompeted them somehow. So birds, thankfully, are part of the reason that we do not have giant flying insects today. But weirdly, some of birds' ancestors had fewer limitations on body size, it seems.
Yeah.
Dinosaurs. What? Why so big?
Why? And I know I was trying to think. I was like, well, it's not really biological constraints. It's like biological, like celebration party.
Fuck the rules. Fuck the rules. Yeah. I'm gonna be huge.
It's like why I'm better at this than everyone else. Interestingly enough. But yeah, I mean, and we know that dinosaurs got stupid huge. I could go at it with a bunch of stats about some of the biggest dinosaurs, but I know half of our listeners know that information way better than I do, so I'm not going to bother too much. But what we're going to talk about is, well, how did dinosaurs get so stupid huge? Why? How were they constrained? If they were constrained, what allowed them to have this crazy diversity of body sizes? I think I read in one of the scientific papers I was looking at this week that the smallest dinosaur and the largest dinosaur are like 20 million times different in size. Like that there is that disparity within dinosaur body size evolution, which is just really, really, really interesting, which is as nice as I'm ever going to be about dinosaurs. There. And I'm glad you were talking about the oxygen levels with the insects, because some of the earliest ideas about why dinosaurs got so big is that there was like, oh, there must have been more oxygen around. And they were just like getting like just jacked on all of that oxygen.
Just getting swole off of O2.
I assume it's like the opposite at living at elevation like I do here, where we had to go get the baby tested like right after birth to make sure that he like had enough oxygen at 8,000 feet.
God.
So anyway, I guess sea level is just great. However, yeah, like we were talking about, scientists have largely debunked this idea that there was more oxygen. It looks like it was pretty similar to what the levels are today. And then also, which I find this really funny, folks also thought for a while that there was like a lower level of gravity, like less gravity. And so they were able to just like whoop, whoop, whoop. So, I love that idea of just like, did we like slow down in our spin? Did the earth change size dramatically? Like, you know, I don't know enough about physics to understand how this would be possible. But the Earth has generally been the same size since the Mesozoic, because geologically it's really not that long ago in terms of the Earth or like the universe. So the gravitational impact and pull is about the same. So again, gravity, oxygen are remaining constants. So how and why? And it looks like there are, morphological reasons behind this. It looks like there's ecological reasons behind this. And then what I also found was really interesting that we'll touch on at the end is how exactly, not just like what did your bones do and whatnot, but how did your physiology actually lead to this increase in size too, with like, how did you grow? Which is, an interesting question on some levels. I'm going to send you an image from that, a figure from that paper too, because I think it looks like a butthole. I have the maturity of a 2-year-old. All right, but let's talk about, if we're talking about big ass dinosaurs, we're talking the biggest of the big, the biggest land animals of all time are going to be sauropods. Okay, sauropods are long neck dinosaurs. Everyone with their brontosaurus, whether or not brontosaurus is a valid genus. Anyway, it's not nearly as big as a lot of the titanosaurs. And those are the ones that are from South America. I'm going to talk about Argentinosaurus because when I lived in Atlanta, they had a mount of Argentinosaurus at the Fernbank Museum where I worked for a very brief amount of time. And it's thought to be, again, one of the largest dinosaurs that ever lived. Because, again, we didn't find all of this dinosaur and we didn't find all of the other giant ones like Patagonosaur. Nope, that's not right. See, we have to cut
Keep
this.
trying. Power through.
No, I can't. They'll hate me. They will- Oh, Dreadnoughtus. Dreadnoughtus is another one of the really big boys. And I don't even want to try. I'm scared of Patagotitan. That's what it is. Patagotitan. God damn it. I hate dinosaur names so much. Anyway, all of these guys are all thought to be like contenders for the biggest dinosaurs that ever lived. Argentinosaurus was thought to be, again, I love this mass estimate that literally is just on Wikipedia, guys. It's thought to be 110,000 pounds to 220,000 pounds.
Oh.
So we're talking about a range varies within 110,000 pound range.
I want you to imagine looking at a person and being like, they're anywhere between 150 pounds and 300 pounds. And I can't tell. I don't know.
Yes, exactly, y'all. Like, this is what we're working with when you're dealing with fossils and when you're trying to extrapolate body size from isolated.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was thought to be about 100 feet long. It could have been up to like 130 feet long. Maybe it was only like 90 feet long. Again, we don't even know how the bones are spaced. Anyway, these guys were freaking huge, though. That's what's important, is these dinosaurs were extremely big. And how did they get so big? Well, there's a few things that we're looking at. You know, they're just, I love this. I was reading this and they're like, they walked on 4 legs. And I was like, well, yeah. But that really does play a role. When you're not constrained by just 2 legs, you're able to put on more mass. You can support more body with 4 legs than 2. So that's why our sauropods get bigger than theropods, which are meat-eating dinosaurs that are generally bipedal. No, I'm pretty sure they're always bipedal. And they are, with their 2 legs, though, they're not constrained by 4. They're better at running. So again, it's all about like trade-offs with evolution. And so sauropods, they've got these 4 legs. Their legs are also right under them. And that's important because, like, unlike a lizard or something like a crocodile, they're actually able to support their body again, a lot more. And these limbs are essentially pillars. Like, they have just like incredible support because of these thick, strong bones. And then we also have pretty immobile joints. So, you know, like, we can do all this like fancy shit with our wrists and ankles. They don't do that. They're like, let's get these super solid so that they can, again, support even more weight on them. And it also helps them disperse their weight well, also. Now, another thing that I kind of want to talk about with some of the mammals, too, is this long neck phenomenon, because a lot of the biggest mammals also have either a long neck or a long trunk, which allows them to reach more food. And it also allows them, I love this laziness, it allows them to stay in one place and reach food without moving, like more than other organisms. And I'm like, that's hot. I never thought about the utter laziness of a long neck for that sort of adaptation. Now, this also ties into some of the ecological constraints, right? So when you have an ecosystem that has a canopy, right? So we've got trees that are growing leaves at different heights, and you might have grasses, probably not at that point, nope, shrubberies, little bushes, and then we've got taller trees, a lot of conifers, some early angiosperms at this point too. And if you have a long neck, you're able to get to a part of the ecosystem that no other dinosaurs are able to access. And so I kind of think about this with giant ground sloths too, with their crazy long claw hands, how they use those not to again, murder each other, but to actually get taller branches off of their trees and whatnot. So again, having this long neck opens up a whole new part of the ecosystem for sauropods to take advantage of and be able to also then eat lots of food by staying in one place. What I find is also interesting is that sauropods, it's not thought that they really chewed their food, which is a difference from mammals as well. It's also because they had gastroliths, so they had stomach stones. that help them digest and break down food as well. But there's an idea that that also saves them energy by not having to chew. And when you think about a cow, like chewing all the goddamn time and
Oh,
then regurgitating their food and chewing it some more just for good measure.
cows, cows sleep 4 hours a day. They ruminate, which means they chew their cud, they chew their own puke, 8 hours a day.
Oh my God. Could you imagine eating your own vomit twice as long as you slept?
Oh, I did also, because it's always confused me. Because I mean, a cow or a sheep burp is not like a glorious smell, but it's not vomit. It's because it's coming from. I didn't get a chance to say any of the four names, but they're such dumbass names. It's coming from like the reticulum of the stomach, so it's not coming from the acid portion of the
Oh.
stomach. So you're just getting like fermented stuff in your mouth, and it's because they don't want to chew it as they're eating it. It's more effective to shove it in, let the bacteria start breaking it down into sugar, and then chew it. But Poodoo, one of my sheep, I will take a video and send it to you at some point. She's a hair sheep, so she doesn't have like a lot of fur on her face, and she will get like she'll just look at me dead in the eyes and just puke a full fucking wad of like bubblegum sized, like just in her cheek, just and just staring dead-eyed at me with no problem whatsoever. Because yeah, I guess they like the taste of their own puke.
Ah,
You'd have to, I suppose.
right. Again, and this is when I don't mean to get on a platform here and be like, evolution is true. But I'm also like, come on, what kind of sick fuck God is like, yeah, this is how it's gonna go.
Hippos,
You're gonna shit
hippos get turned on by their own poop, and sheep get to eat their own puke
Yes.
24/7. This world is gonna be wild.
Yes, and we didn't talk about it. I think we'll have to get to it in another episode. But I also know that lagomorphs, like rabbits, they have a weird gut system
Oh,
too,
yeah.
where they're not able to fully digest everything. So they end up eating their own poop a lot to be able to digest it and get the nutrients out of
Yeah.
it. And again, I just see that and I'm just like, okay, like guys, evolution is true. Like what weird creator is up there like maniacally being like, and then this cute animal will eat its own shit. It just doesn't. It doesn't make.
It doesn't make sense.
You know, I just come on. Evolution is again a tinkerer. You work
Yeah.
with what you got. It's good enough. It's not great. It's not great. Oh gosh. Wow. All right.
Yeah.
So sauropods.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing that I was reading about with the ecosystem aspect is some scientists think that there may have been just lower levels of productivity in the ecosystem in the Mesozoic, and that there wouldn't have been as much flora to support all the fauna and whatnot, and that could have led to these animals getting much bigger because it allowed them to have like and like less actual dinosaurs that were around too, like within their population there were less sauropods, and this would allow them to just like hold on to their biomass and take a really long time to digest their food and suck everything out of it because there wasn't a lot of other options going on with these low population and low just ecosystem availability. And I don't know if I'm explaining that very well. I'll have to read more about some of it because it was very, very interesting to just think that. And then when I was reading about island gigantism, it did kind of touch on those ideas as well, is that if you get bigger, you can take longer to digest your food, like a giant tortoise perhaps, and therefore you can go longer between feedings as well. So maybe sauropods were able to just like ride it out on their giant, slow digesting stomachs, which leads us into why were they able to get bigger than mammals? Why are they better at getting bigger than what we see in mammals? And the slow metabolism is a big part of that they had these really big stomachs that allowed their food to stay in their systems much longer and digest more and therefore get more nutrients out of it. And they weren't probably constrained by, we don't know. I would love to know about sauropod diarrhea. Like, come on, someone tell me if this is a thing. But we also know that they are using gizzard stones, that they have these gastroliths. So they're using these unique ways to also go about using less energy to break down their food as well. And then a really big one about why they're able to do this better than mammals is because they have more of a bird-like breathing system, and they also have air sacs or pneumatized bones, especially in their neck. I've seen sauropod neck vertebrae that are just full of these really intricate pockets and kind of openings and whatnot. And those are all allowing for air sacs to be there, allowing their neck to be a little bit lighter, but it also helps them have a better, more efficient breathing system where, like birds, they're actually able to have a supply of oxygen in their system even as they're exhaling and breathing out. They're still able to maintain that oxygen. And again, talking about oxygen levels, more oxygen allows you to be bigger a lot of times too. It was fascinating to dive into the why instead of just less gravity, which again, I love that idea. Let's do that.
I do too.
And then I read this really interesting paper that came out in Science this last year that was all about how did they grow so big. Like usually biologically, you have two options for doing that. You can either grow faster, right? So like early on, like you're going to go through a much faster growth spurt, or you have a longer period in which you grow. So you've extended your growth time. So this paper actually looked at the bones of theropod dinosaurs. So again, these meat-eating dinosaurs, so bipedal predators that don't get nearly as big as the sauropods, but still got very, very, very large, including bigger than some of these biggest mammals. And they looked at how these dinosaurs grow, and they created, by looking at the growth rings in the different dinosaur bones through the paleohistology, they're able to figure out that dinosaurs didn't really follow any of the rules. T-Rex did it one way, and then I feel like Spinosaurus did it totally differently. Like, yeah, T-Rex decided to have faster growth rates. Like they just got bigger faster. And then Spinosaurus instead like extended its amount of time that had relatively slow growth, but did it over a longer amount of time. Even though none of them have like crazy long lifespans either. So it's very interesting to think about. Anyway, so dinosaurs are fascinating kind of. And it's interesting to go into the ecological constraints of this. And we're not going to dive into it on this episode because we don't have time, and we're probably going to cut this down as is and make some bonus content as well. However, we hear you all screaming about islandism and island gigantism and island dwarfism, and we hear you. It's just too dense of a topic to include in this. It does tie in to what we're talking about, and it does, where you live does have a lot to say about your constraints of what your body can do. And we will be talking about that because it's very interesting that a lot of times small organisms that are small on the mainland on an island get much bigger, like a lot of rodents. And then also a lot of animals that are bigger in the mainland, like artiodactyls and like proboscideans, like we've been talking about, get smaller when they're on an island because they don't have to be as big and like scary to predators when there aren't any big predators. So then you get the cute channel.
They can just be themselves.
They can be adorable. I've always wanted to go to the Channel Islands off the coast of California because they have pygmy mammoths, fossil pygmy mammoths there because of, again, island dwarfism. So we'll have to do that. Maybe we can go there or go to, you were just in California, but we can go again.
It's still there. Yeah, it hasn't disappeared.
Thank you for listening. If you liked the podcast, be sure to rate and review us on your listening platform of choice. We really, really, really appreciate it.
If you'd like to hear more and support the show, you can follow us on Patreon for some exclusive bits or on our various social media platforms. You can follow Amy on Instagram at Mary Anning's Revenge.
And Megan on Instagram and TikTok as GeoPedalFabric, or both of us at Weird and Dead on Instagram and TikTok. This podcast is brought to you by the Geology Podcasting Network, produced by the Traveling Geologist, aka Chris Spencer. Our theme song is Unlock Me by Praz Canal.
You can follow them on Spotify, PRAZKHANAL.
Cover art was provided by Chris Spencer and the hosts.
Editing services were provided by Abby Jansen and Chris Spencer and a little bit of us as well. And this has been hosted and researched by us, Amy Atwater and Megan Weatherall. Thank you for listening.
Even with the delay, I could hear you laughing the second I said sexy diarrhea. I couldn't How could it keep it together? It's so fucking stupid.